Okay, cool. Yeah, so going back to sort of Plato said, the stories, those who tell stories rule the world, because I think we're ultimately a storytelling, social, purpose-led species. And often it's stories that help us make meaning of the world around us and legitimize some courses of action and delegitimize others. And so what I want to explore with you today is what are the stories we tell ourselves about the economy and how does that enable or constrain our practice as change agents? So what we've got planned is, having sort of done the welcome, I'm going to share a bit of the kind of the why and the what on this work around narratives for a new economy. Then we're going to have a kind of keeping it interactive, the first breakout, which really looks at your reactions to that sort of principles and narrative. And then we're going to come back as a whole group to share reflections. And then we're going to move on to looking at what that might mean for our practice as change agents and how might we use this in our work. And then again, reflect as a whole group. So that's kind of what we got planned. So let's start then. Well, why do we need a new narrative? Well, as many of you will have seen the latest Potsdam Institute research, which shows that of the 9 planetary limits, we've exhausted 7 of them. And so we're essentially, I use the analogy, if we were driving a car right now, and we had sort of 6 of sort of 9 indicators on red, we'd be pulling over pretty quickly to find a garage and fix the car. But we're not doing that with our global system, the only home we know. In fact, we're kind of accelerating forward. So I think the story so far then is we know we need urgent transformation. We're midway through the decisive decade, and what a lot of the experts are saying is we're about 5 to 10 years away from cascading systemic crises which is on track for undermining civilization. We also know the current economic model spectacularly isn't working. That we're having growing inequality, climate change crisis, with destroying nature at industrial accelerating levels. We also know the systems we need to transform, like food, energy, cities, and so on. And we know what we need to transform them towards. But we also know that no one economic actor on their own can fix this. So we can't just leave it to business. We can't just leave it to governments. We know we need all economic actors involved. We also know that the old narrative dominates and is extremely well funded and organized. But also the alternative narratives are often fragmented, unclear, and the average, if you like, person isn't aware of, this alternative economic models. And therefore, I think that presents a problem for when we're trying to transform sectors, systems, value chains, cities, because we lack that imaginative scaffolding to think about, well, how do we imagine how the economy works? If we're trying to change the food system and working with the food business, how do we understand their role as opposed to the role of finance or civil society or government? And I think without that imaginative scaffolding, the risk is we collapse back into old, outdated forms of operating, like businesses just chase profit or public money for public good. So what I want to kind of explore, I think, is an opportunity to explore not only what the downstream effects of the economy are, and that's where I think I'd argue most of the debate happens. We talk about growing climate, carbon emissions or plastic waste or growing inequality. But what we don't necessarily do is trace that upstream to, well, what are the fundamental stories and beliefs we tell ourselves that then in turn shape structures and policies that in turn shape cultures and behaviors in institutions and markets and so on, that then lead to those outcomes. So what I want to share with you today is some work where we're trying to trace both the current economic system, what are those upstream stories and beliefs, and how do they lead to those downstream outcomes? And the purpose that really is, therefore, the opportunity here is to engage the early majority. So not necessarily leaders like us who kind of get the need for transformation, but how do we engage the early majority of leaders who are anxious about the future, but don't know what the solutions are? And I suggest that narratives and visions are really powerful tools to offer people, as Victoria Hirth, my collaborator, says, to give them the clarity and confidence to act with courage. And I would argue that there's a huge amount of work being done on the new economy, a lot of which we're involved in, whether that's the role of sustainable business, post-GDP metrics, sustainable finance, and so on. So there's all these bits of the jigsaw puzzle, but it often feels like we lack the picture on the top of the box. What's the overall narrative that this all ladders up to that provides meaning, coherence, and purpose? So I want to share with you the outcome of some work in progress at the moment, and it's very much in the test and learn phase. I'd love your thoughts on this, which is I want to share with you a kind of a draft structure narrative, which is starting off with, well, what are the shared aspirations? What is the life we would like to lead? Well, often people think, well, there's 8 billion people, Ben, and you'll get 8 billion answers to that question. But the evidence would suggest otherwise from both research and conversations globally. The following pieces you can see here would suggest that this is what most people want from life. They want to feel part of healthy communities. They want meaningful, fairly paid work and time to spend with loved ones and to lead a fulfilling life, what's often called the art of life, and access to clean air, energy, water, and housing. But they also want to feel optimistic about the future and future generations, and that life and conditions are improving. But the reality is that's very far from most people, not just in low-income countries, but also high-income countries as well. The reality is that's very far from most people. So let's contrast that then, which is what's the reality most people face today? Well, the downstream effects is often of people feeling that they're overworked, they're exhausted, they're on the treadmill, they're time poor, and their work is often in conflict with their own personal values. They also are anxious about growing inequality in fragmented societies, exacerbated with things like, mental health and loneliness and so on. Also, anxiety over overconsumption and often the distress that causes, and this sort of growth in take, make, waste products that are, through convenience, and often that's leading to what's often called defensive spending, or because we don't have time to spend with our loved ones, we buy things to compensate for that lack, and we're anxious about the growing evidence we have of nature and climate destruction. But also that we're, for the first time in particularly high-income countries, that the next generation feel like they're worse off than the previous generation, whereas since the war, often that's been improving. So what I want to suggest is that this is doing exactly what the economy is designed to do. These are not arbitrary outcomes or like the weather. These are just arbitrary, but actually these are very specific outcomes that are doing exactly what the economy is designed to do. And you'll notice the arrow in the top right sort of shows that symbol of our current economy. It's all about more growth, more improvements, always about an upward trajectory. So if we go upstream then, what are those sort of fundamental beliefs and assumptions that drive that economic equation? Well, there are 3 flaws to these assumptions. The first is that we assume that money is a proxy for well-being. But the reality is that isn't the case. It overlooks the drivers of both human and natural well-being. Also, markets are assumed to be neutral, which overlooks the power dynamics and influence of elites in markets, and particularly free markets. It also assumes that nature is separate from the economy, and so it overlooks the fundamental stocks and sinks required of both nature and society to fully function, whether that's healthy communities, fisheries, forests, and so on. And those assumptions that money is a proxy for well-being then leads to core structures and policies, which is around maximizing growth, because more growth is meant to equal more well-being. Also, that we then want to maximize markets and minimize the role of state, because states are seen as incompetent and markets are seen as efficient. Therefore, we want to put the provision of goods and services into the market. And we want financial institutions to maximize financial value, because more financial value equals more well-being. And that in turn requires businesses to maximize profits, because more profits equals more finance equals more well-being. So far, so familiar. But then if we go midstream, what effects that have on businesses? And as we all know, those working with businesses, that requires and necessitates particularly publicly listed businesses to do 3 things. First of all, it needs to minimize its labor and maximize labor efficiency. So that means having as few people working as long as possible, which leads to people feeling often overworked. And it's that kind of work more culture. It leads to that being often transactional, and also leads to inequality, where there's lots of competition to buy that sort of particularly high talent. The second thing it requires them to do is to create insatiable demand for products and services to increase the turnover of products and services. And because that's considered to lead to more profits, leads to more well-being. The third thing it requires them to do is to externalize the costs. So that's economic jargon for putting costs onto nature and society, whether that's pollution or social harm like obesity. Because if, say, you're a fast-moving consumer goods, you actually priced in the plastics you're putting into the market, that would immediately put you at a competitive disadvantage to your competitors. And so what that does is that shapes production, and production shapes lives. So both on the demand side, what that's doing is it's creating if you like, competition for goods and services, where it's often driven by scarcity. And also on the supply side of labour, it restricts and creates huge amounts of competition in the labour market. And that then leads to isolation through creating inequality, leads to people being time poor, and creates competition between employees and consumers. It creates scarcity, deliberately creates scarcity in the markets, fueling the cost of living crisis. It also drives materialistic status anxiety, because often that creating insatiability through advertising is often about undermining needs rather than meeting needs. And also leads to that insecurity, because it's liquidizing nature and society, leading to the climate and nature crisis and deepening mental health crisis due to this sort of fragmentation of relationships by creating competition through consumers. And so what that does is, if we pull that together, is creates this sort of vicious cycles. So if we start at the top, the assumption that money equals well-being means that businesses are required to maximize profits, which in turn, as we've seen, maximizes labor, minimizes labor, maximizes demand and externalities, which then aggregated together across the global economy leads to the poly crisis. It leads to inequality and low pay. It leads to insecurity and cost of living crisis, and drives overconsumption and the nature and climate breakdown. And notice that this is in direct conflict with the well-being that was the evidence-based well-being we saw earlier. It's in direct conflict with that. Also, it leads to fragile economies, because you have centralized power based around often a few key players. We have oligopolies in most industries now, and that centralized power and of value chains. And also it leads to very lean systems, because any surplus resources potential cost savings and maximizes profits. So we end up with very lean supply chains and value chains. And that's the opposite of what resilient systems look like, which are devolved and have fat in the system for resilience. But also what that centralized power means, you have very much centralized economic power, which it gets exerted onto, used as political power. And that means that often states, therefore, are required to grow, because the assumption is that more growth in GDP equals more well-being, even though I'd argue the opposite is the case, and to reduce their tax revenues as well. So governments that therefore are often required to reduce spending, but on the same time they have to increase public services to pay for clearing up after the poly crisis. So whether that's mental health crisis, clearing up after pollution, and also needs that the market can't meet, because the market is focusing on where the profit is rather than where social needs are. And hence why we have an oversupply of things like luxury and an undersupply of things like sanitation and housing. And so governments are therefore caught between, on the one hand, lower tax revenues and increased demand, which often leaves them being indebted. Sound familiar? And so the risk is, if we have more growth, we're going to get more of the same. So perhaps it's time to revisit some of the fundamental assumptions we often hold about the economy. And there's a lot of thinking suggests that it's the fundamental assumptions in the frame we hold, which is where we need to kind of shine the light and question the assumptions. Otherwise, we'll get more of the same. But how do we do that in a way which doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which keeps things that work about the current system, but only adjusts the things that don't? But a lot of people think, but Ben, you must be meaning communism, right? And that didn't work. After Francis Fukuyama famously said, the kind of end of history, that the whole idea is, since the crumble of communism, that this is the only version we've got. But there is current sort of form of capitalism. But there are many forms of capitalism, and I'd argue we've picked the wrong one. So what is that alternative then to, is the current form of capitalism the only game in town? Well, the reality is that if we don't, to step into a new future, we have to imagine it first. So last year, I brought together a number of leaders across the new economy thinking, who range from any school of thought, which is essentially seeing that the economy should serve everybody. So not just the Northern Hemisphere or the 1%, but everybody, and should do that within environmental limits. So brought together a whole range of experts, but also leaders from representing different parts of the economy. So business, finance, and government. So it was really grounded in practice. And so we had an amazing group of people, ranging from academics from the Cambridge University. We had people from Ernst & Young, their new economy unit, who did a great report on that. We had Emmy Bidston, who's from both the Harvard Flourishing Project, but also the Oxford Character Project, doing great work on the role of character. We had Esme from Regenerate, who are doing a lot of advisory work with parties. We had Professor Fergus Lyon from the from the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, working closely with Tim Jackson, and Gay Harrington, a thought leader from the US. We had Joe Swinson, the former MP and who heads up partnerships for a new economy. We had representatives from the Welsh government and the Scottish government who are doing leading work in this area. Catherine Trebeck, author of Economics of Arrival and also co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. We had Sophie Grippenberg from Economy for the Common Good, Till from the Club of Rome, and also Zhao Ting from Donut Economics. So we had these incredible kind of range of thought leaders, but also representatives from the finance sector. We had the chief economist from the Scottish government. We had John Granholm, who's a recovering asset manager, and Hans, who's chief economist at the Triodos Bank. And as you can see here, leaders from business, you know, former directors from Vodafone and the CBI and so on. And so we came together and said, well, what are the common principles we inquired into, both the foundational principles of the new economy, but also crucially, how would different economic actors, what would their functions be to provide that imaginative scaffolding? So I wanted to kind of share, first of all, before we look at how it would work, what would it be like? So if I've shared the downstream effects of what would be living like in the current economy that we know so well, what would the future economy look like? Well, it's something we're describing as the plentiful life, where I've worked with creatives to play with this idea, where we would have more time for loved ones to spend with loved ones and have a fulfilling life. There'd be more work, but better paid jobs, but shorter working week, but more meaningful because those jobs would be aligned with well-being outcomes. There would be less consumption, but higher quality products that would last for longer. There'd be greater business innovation that would attract and crowd in investment that would deliver on well-being goals. And businesses would therefore be shifting towards more circular net zero products and services. There'd also be more public investment that would, rather than clearing up the mess of the poly crisis, actually investing in basic needs and well-being outcomes. And there'd also be very strong local engagement in local communities to have both shape and deliver priorities for their communities. And there'd be access to affordable, clean water, food, housing, and energy. Now, I realise you may be saying, Ben, what have you been smoking? This all sounds too good to be true. But stay with me. I want to argue for why that would be the case. We need to start upstream. We need to start with some fundamental, those fundamental failures of our current system. Otherwise, if we don't, we're going to stay with what we've always got. And notice the symbol. Rather than that upward curve of always more, this is about the infinity. Because remember, in nature, the only thing that grows exponentially is cancer. So what this is about is recognizing what the rest of nature does, which is about being in balance, about being regenerative. So starting upstream, it's a recognition that people are part of nature and dependent on it and each other for its flourishing, unlike the old economy, which sees it as being independent and superior to nature. It would see well-being as lying in flourishing relationships between people and the natural world, recognizing this reciprocity of a relationship. And society is a complex system embedded within the natural world, not separate from it. And therefore, societal success is delivering shared well-being for current and future generations. And so the purpose of the economy is to serve the long-term well-being of people and the planet. Whereas I'd argue that because of those misgivings, our current economy is what people and planet are serving the economy. This would be reversing it. So what would that sort of imaginative scaffolding look like? How would that be similar or different to today? Well, in many ways, parts of the economy would be working similarly, but here's how it'd be different. First of all, the civil society would be working very closely with governments through participatory democracy methods to essentially say, what are those well-being goals, drawing on that consensus about saying, what are our common needs that we, whether that's health, housing, security, and so on, being clear about what those well-being goals are that we all share. And then shaping markets, incentivizing markets to deliver on those well-being goals and setting parameters within which they need to operate. And as our collaborator Victoria Hirth points out in her new book, Beyond Profit, is that this is often the core elements of governance that is missing. We need to be clear on the purpose. What is an economy or any system there to serve? What are the parameters it's operating within? And then the strategy is, how do you deliver that purpose within the parameters? So the state, unlike today, is setting those two, which is, what is the purpose, which is the well-being goals? What are the parameters we operate within, which could be things like net zero, restorative of nature, levels of inequality and the amount that's permissible to spend on advertising, as agreed with civil society. And then what we have is then businesses are then incentivized to deliver on those. So there's this distinction between the macroeconomy and the microeconomy. So the macroeconomy is shaped by the state, but then you still have the microeconomy where you have trade between companies and individuals. So it's not like the state is suddenly going to tell you what to have for breakfast, so we have the same kind of competition. So it allows all of those positives of the private sector, competition, innovation, so on, to unleash all of that, but within, if you like, bounded rather than free markets. So they are, and if you think market, there's no such thing as a free market. Today we are shaping markets, but the point is we have this massive democratic deficit where that isn't being decided by civil society or even politicians. It's being decided by the market, whereas this would be bringing that back into the public domain, decided those ends. So the macroeconomy would be reshaped, but then you're leaving freedom within the microeconomy. So that would then incentivize businesses to deliver those goods and services that are reaching those well-being outcomes, orientating our core productive capacity towards well-being outcomes. That would therefore focus on material efficiency, not labor efficiency, that would lead to more better quality work and with less inequality, leading to better paid work. So then we have civil societies both engaged in shaping those well-being goals and actively engaged in their delivery. So rather than today where most of the provisions of goods and services is delivered in the market, this would be more balanced about both the market, through the state, through civil society, commons, household, and then finance would be shifting because it'd be focusing on funding those well-being economic activities in the real economy. Unlike today, where most of finance is financing finances, or is known as FIRE, which is finance, insurance, and real estate, not the real economy itself. So that would be the shift. And that would then lead to this sort of reinforcing virtuous circles, where because we then say, well, the state is engaging with setting those well-being parameters, it would then incentivize purpose-led businesses to deliver on them, fixing those market failures we have today, which would then incentivize them to deliver meaningful, fairly paid work and well-being goods and services within environmental limits, which then aren't creating the mess that needs to be cleared up by public services. That would lead to genuine well-being outcomes. That would also lead to a stronger economy because it'd be more decentralized and diverse. And then also free the state up, having structured markets and is to then invest in public services positively. Whereas a lot, for example, at the moment are having to fund a lot of, both paying to clear up the mess from the poly crisis, but also having bailed out banks and from those market failures. That's where a lot of public spending and debt goes at the moment. So that would free up positive investment into partnerships, which would crowd in and benefit private and public investment along the lines of some of the work done by Mariana Mazzucato, you might be familiar with. So summarizing then, this would be based on the principles for a new economy, which were set out by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance through consultation, which the group I convened agree with, which is the idea that institutions are they're purpose-driven to serve the common good, or these wellbeing goals, that create true value, unlike today, which is pure financial value, often at the expense of undermining natural and social value. It'd be deeply participatory. So rather than leaving it to market, which essentially means leaving it to elites with it or oligarchs within markets, it would be brought into public debate. Also that the economy would be designed to deliver dignity, where everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety and happiness. Justice would be at the heart of the economy, and nature would be seen that they're restored in the process. So the key shifts then we see between the old extractive economy, which is based on extraction of both financial value, resources, and to the new plentiful economy, is shifting from one which leads to isolation to connection, from scarcity to abundance, and from insecurity to security. Because notice how the current economy is focused on what's called external goods, physical goods, whether that's property, products, and power, which has built into it scarcity and competition. Whereas when you shift to the wellbeing economy, often that focuses more on internal goods. So there will be some external goods you need as means to ends, like we all need, medicines, houses, and so on. But it would have more of a focus on what genuinely delivers well-being, which is about relationships and connection, which is very abundant, is less material resourceful, whether that's things like music, sport, and so on. And also would lead to greater security, both social and natural security. And the other thing is that there's growing evidence that most people want this. So rather than most people thinking they're in a minority, actually the people who want this new economy are in a silent majority. And so finally, before we break into discussion groups, I want to kind of just share a few reflections. What might that mean for us as both employees, leaders, and citizens? Well, first of all, for those of us working in and with organizations, we can think about, well, what are the well-being, how can we shape well-being goals and parameters? Perhaps where we have a voice, our lobbying or advocacy with governments, either at a local or national level. How can we shape political aspirations, either within or with political parties and political movements? How do we influence policy and regulation at either the sector level, again, at the city level, value chains, or national levels that are delivering well-being outcomes? How can we challenge and inspire the role of economic actors to think in a more progressive way that draws on the best thinking, not out of date, centuries-old ways to think about how those economic actors operate? For those of us in strategy roles, how can we shape organizational purpose and strategy that is delivering well-being outcomes? Do we also call out the current reality and how it's not working and who's benefiting and losing by the current reality? And also engaging with those sectoral initiatives to shape transition pathways, where that's in things like food, energy, and cities. As citizens, how can we create debates within our networks of friends and families, also calling out the current reality? And also, how might we engage locally in community groups and campaigns to shape those well-being goals and deliver them? And how might we use our voice to influence politicians? How do we invest wisely in our funds, and how do we choose wisely through our products and services? So I've covered a lot of ground. What I'd love to do now is to jump